How's it going, everyone? We've got another guest with us. Our guest today is John. Welcome back. How have you been?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. I appreciate you being here. I noticed you've gotten a haircut since we last spoke, and as we were speaking briefly, my hair has grown and my beard has grown. Um, yeah, I went through a bit of a, I guess you could call it like a hermit phase, which is part of my formula, I guess, or part of the formula. I sort of do my own thing for something like 9 months, and then I take 3 months to document and share, um, and sort of condense everything that I learned. Or experienced. And so yeah, that's me at this right here. Um, so yeah, what have you been up to over the last year since we spoke?
Yeah, I mean, just a lot of crazy stuff. I We were in Europe for a while, probably 3 months, maybe 3 months.
Okay.
Um, but I think we've been back now for close to a year. I think it's been like at least almost like a year and a half since we
Okay.
uh, since we talked, really, or
Hmm.
we did the last video.
Yeah, you and I we chat
I mean, we
via
chat.
like
Yeah.
texting and stuff, but we haven't done this, and yeah, it's definitely been over a year.
Yeah.
So what was going on in Europe? Is that something you can talk about, or was that just sort of like a vacation kind of family thing?
Yeah, it was just kind of a family thing, and it was my wife reconnecting with you know, long-standing friends that she's known for like 30 years.
Mm,
So, and they've set up like a little kind of bohemian community in Spain. So it's like this
very cool.
small mountain village in Spain. So that was a lot of fun. That was a very interesting. I've never been to Spain, so um, yeah, just seeing that sort of like really old Catholic culture. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? That's like hardcore, because I think Spain was like one of the most hardcore of the Catholic countries. Um,
Yeah.
and that's something that's familiar to me. I think we talked last time where it was like coming from a Russian Orthodox background. It's like I'm used to the presence of the church or religion like as a cultural thing. Uh,
Hmm.
and in the States, obviously, there is none of that. And even in Europe, there isn't much of it because a lot of Europe is moved into kind of this more like agnostic, sort of like very secular um, sort of society.
Hmm.
But in Spain, like even you take France and Spain, they're both Catholic countries, but France is like completely secular. But in Spain, there's still this really strong connection to like the old ways, like the
Do
ancient
you do you
meditation.
think that might have anything to do with there were a lot of philosophers in France. And there were, I don't want to say more artists in Spain, but it seems like the cultures themselves approached things differently. Some of the great philosophers come from France, so that makes me wonder if that didn't pull them into a more secular perspective,
Yeah,
whereas in Spain they stayed more toward religion and things like that, perhaps.
I think you've got a couple things going on. One of the things, it's like I think you have to go back to the time of the Roman Empire, when France and that area, like the really populated area around Paris, when that was still like a Roman outpost, and
Mm.
when Spain was also, in its own way, also kind of a Roman outpost. Um, but the confluences of cultures became very different. Like Paris became very cosmopolitan, almost from the get go. And
Okay.
Spain seemed to stay in this like real rural, rustic. Um, there's a, I guess you could call it like the Iberian culture, which is kind of like this rustic Latinate type culture, whereas France has got a different vibe. It's more cosmopolitan, it's more oriented towards trade and
Okay.
things like that. Whereas Spain's very rocky. I was
Mm.
blown away by how mountainous it is.
Okay.
And I think the terrain has a lot to do with it as well. Um,
Yeah.
you know, uh, you can call it feng shui, but I do think that something like that is also um, a big deal. I think ancient people made a huge science out of like determining a
Certainly.
where something ought to be built, like where a community or a I don't know what you would call it, even a village, but certainly anything that became
Yeah.
like a large populated area.
A civilization, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's so many different considerations went into this. I think that, and that's explains why places like London or Paris or any of these other big cities, like why they're so long lasting, is because
Mm.
of that care that went into choosing the location, the physical location.
Yeah, and we don't really consider that these days. And that was so important back then. The geology determined the nature of sustainability,
Yeah.
and certainly determined the type of culture. People who civilizations in the desert had they would use different symbols for similar themes.
Yeah.
Like where one person would use an eagle for something, if they lived in like a mountainous like plain region, someone in the desert might use a scorpion for the same theme that someone would use an eagle for. And so yeah, that the climate, the region, the geology all plays a huge, or at least it did back then, played a huge role. And
Mhm.
that's not something we consider, even to the point of like ley lines and things like that,
Mhm. Oh yeah, I
or
think
dragon lines as they were called in feng shui, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And yeah, that being said, it's like it's like the temple of Athena in Greece has a very different feel than
Mm.
some
Mhm.
kind of either an Arabic fortress in Spain or even one of those later like stone monolithic Catholic churches.
Sure.
Um, they just fit with their environment in a way that um, it's very integrative. It's the culture, the traditions, the language, the
Yeah.
architecture. It's all interweaved.
Yeah, yeah.
You
And
know?
that, uh-huh.
So it's just one of those things. And even just seeing how the Muslim cultural elements have interwoven with the Spanish and the Iberian and the Latin elements as well, and it's created this very unusual structure.
Mm.
So, like I said, that's what makes Spain unique, because it's not just this hardcore Catholicism, but there's this crazy Islamic layer
Sure.
on there that's like it's very powerful, it's very influential, um, and it's just part of the fabric. Like that, I mean, the Arabs were kicked out um, hundreds of years ago, um, 800 years ago, 700. I mean, it was a way back when. And yet, this is a reality that's palpable every single day you're there. Every day you're in Spain. You cannot escape the quote Arab question, especially down where we were, which is where the Alhambra is.
What
Okay.
is that? I'm unfamiliar with that.
This is a famous Arabic fortress.
Okay.
And I almost want to say, again, just judging by the architecture, I'm not an expert, but I actually think that there's a Mughal influence. In other words, a the Mughal culture was the they went into India. This is when Islam contacted India,
Interesting.
and I wonder if there's just some kind of odd connection between that line of the Muslim tree and what later ends up in Spain, because there's these very characteristic uh, trifold windows that you see that tend to be more characteristic of the Mughal civilization, and yet you see those in Spain, southern Spain. So it makes you wonder just whether it's trade routes or influences, or it's pretty wild.
It's very interesting. And you mentioned the feel and the palpable energy and some of these places, as well as the degree and difference in nature of the feeling. And that makes me, I typically go one of two ways, if not both, whenever I think about that. Is one, how much of that is related to the geology, like we were talking about? How much
Yeah.
is that related to the symbolism in the temples and the fortresses, the colors, the window shapes, all of that stuff? And how much is related to the thought form, the egregore
Yeah,
of
exactly.
the peoples?
Right, right. Can I just ask you, how do I adjust the volume on this? Is that on your end or is that on my end?
That might be on, I might just not be talking. We are good to go. I can hear you. You can hear
Okay.
me.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Okay. So thank you for mentioning it. So yes, we were talking, I believe, about the egregore and its relation to the geology and the symbolism used in some of these temples and fortresses.
Yeah.
And certainly the nature of energy would probably change between whether or not the place was a temple or a fortress.
And the funny thing about the Alhambra is it's got the energy of both. It's got the energy of a palace,
Okay.
a fortress, and a temple.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm saying? And
I
that's one
do,
of the
yeah.
reasons that makes I'm telling you, its effect seems to extend out for hundreds of miles. Because it, again, this is just my impression of it, but you can really feel that feeling for a long distance. It's whether you want to say that it's that seamless with its environment or whether it's exerting some kind of additional effect on the environment. That's
Uh-huh.
really hard to say, but there is definitely something there that, because I remember, I mean, I lived there for 3 months, and so I was kind of in the vicinity there
Yeah.
for a long time, and I was also consciously thinking about it. Um, and yeah, I have to say that I came away like sacred architecture makes a huge difference in really the kind of life that takes place in its vicinity or in its surroundings,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
So I see, I love your attire and I see the color peeking out. It reminds me of stained glass a bit, and I love stained glass. What were there any cool stained glass motifs or murals or anything like that in any of these places that you saw?
It's funny you say that because actually in Spain there's an absence of stained glass. If you
Uh-huh.
compare it to France, for example, in France, stained glass is everywhere.
Mm.
But oddly enough, in Spain, in the Catholic churches, you often have a dark grotto-like sensation.
Hmm.
I mean, it's different than the Gothic cathedrals of France. It's it's these churches are dark. Let me tell you. You go into these altars and they're gilded with more gold and silver than you have ever seen. And I don't even think anything in the Gothic cathedrals can compare to the opulence, the sheer amount of precious metal.
Mm.
But then in the altar itself, you will have these gigantic glass, silver, and gold reliquaries. They look like they weigh hundreds of pounds, and they're filled with skulls.
Yes. Ah.
I mean, you're just talking hundreds, if not thousands, of skulls piled 20 feet high on all sides. And then
That's
there's this gigantic thing on the altar itself.
that's remarkable. And I knew I may be overstepping my boundary here, but I knew that it had to be somewhat dark because you said that it was dark and you were raised Russian Orthodox. And what I know about the Russian Orthodoxy is it is very macabre and very I don't know what to say other than dark. It is very aware of the cycles of life, I guess I'll say, from what I've seen. But that's beautiful.
I don't think there's anything that compares to the Spanish sense of the macabre. There's not a single Orthodox monastery that could even come close to this.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wow.
So did you get to witness any rituals or processions occurring in any of these temples at any point?
The only thing I experienced in that sense, because most of the churches were either between services or they had become a shared space between tourists and churchgoers, that probably 80% of the church's activity is devoted to tourism, and then a small portion, which only the locals know about, is devoted to services. So if you happen to be traveling through, your chances are you're going to get there when it's just functioning as a tourist site.
Right.
And that's what most of these churches were like. But there was one exception, and that was a very small convent, which is basically for nuns.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like right in the middle of one of the busiest sectors in the so-called Arab quarter, I guess, which is the area that's directly adjacent to the fortress.
Mm.
So it's an extremely busy tourist spot. I mean, it's nothing like St. Peter's, but it's still quite busy. And this is a very small convent. There's probably no more than 20 nuns who live there on a permanent basis. Most of them seem quite old, but you can't see their faces. They're all in white, and their faces are completely veiled. So they're like, they're total like, what's the word? Well, not quite. They're not shut-ins entirely, but they have like very, very, very little interaction with people.
Like an ascetic, maybe?
Well, they're ascetics, but I'm talking this is next level. They're called like anchorites. Okay. They're not
okay.
They're almost at that level. Okay. An anchorite is someone who literally has no human contact whatsoever. These people, these nuns do, but it's very limited human contact. It's much stricter than other monasteries, even, or other convents. So there's a special, they have their special order, which is stricter than most places. And on top of that, they function 24/7. So the services never actually stop. And they go in these rotations where one group of nuns will come in for several hours. They'll do their cycle. Then they go off to rest. The second rotation comes in, they'll go. And then the third rotation. And so this is like 24/7. So there's basically chanting that's going on 24/7 in this place. Okay. It takes a lot of energy to sustain that kind of thing.
I was just going to say the amount of energetic vibration that is charging the walls and foundation and ceilings of that place. That place has to just be ringing with energy. It just has to feel so alive.
Yeah. And it etched itself into my awareness in a way that I'll definitely never forget. You know, you have some memory, but it's like, okay, that went in deep.
Core memory achieved.
Yes, exactly. It was like a brand, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That's hilarious. There's been a few places that I've experienced that have been like that. But I haven't really been to too many other countries. So most of the mystique and very deep feelings of atmospheric pressure that I've received had been out in like nature, hiking and backpacking. And all of a sudden, like you make one turn and the trees open up and you just see this ridge, or you see this mountain face, or you enter this woodland grotto and you take one step and everything just falls silent, and there's just this, I don't know, this acute awareness of this energy running through things.
Yeah. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. We've got the redwood forests here,
Oh yeah.
and they a lot of people call them um, like forest cathedrals,
Yeah.
because the trees create those kinds of acoustics that you would only get in a huge Gothic cathedral. It's
Yeah.
this kind of cavernous silence, if that makes sense. Uh,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
That's one thing that I've heard people talk about, is how cathedrals are in many ways they mimic forests, because they are supposed to be continually growing and they're supposed to be continually built upon.
Yeah,
But they're made of stone, so it's like this interplay of natural and of organic and inorganic, I guess.
yeah,
That's beautiful. And yeah, it makes me wonder, like the acoustics in the cathedrals, like where did they get that idea from? Probably, mountainous ravines and caverns and forest
absolutely.
grottos.
Yeah, I think caves were
Yeah.
the original temples.
Yeah.
You know what I
Well,
mean?
there's a pretty important cave here that is related to temples as well.
Exactly, exactly.
Very interesting. So yeah, was there anything else about Europe that you wanted to share?
Uh, no, I think that's germane to our conversation. I think that's pretty much it.
Hmm. So what else have you been up to besides, you were in Europe for 3 months? What about the other 9 months? What were you up to that you can share with us during that time period?
Um, well, there's just been a lot of sort of personal stuff with moving and
Hmm.
aging in-laws and that kind of thing. Um, my kids are in a really busy time of life right now.
Hmm.
So that's busy. Coming back has been kind of busy because we're now sort of dealing with the aging in-laws. Well, in this case, it's my wife's mother. My parents passed away a number of years ago, but so we're kind of going through that, and it's a sobering experience, because I remember when I was a kid, um, 4, 5, maybe even 6 different family members came to the house to die, basically.
I remember you talking about that in the last video.
Yeah, yeah. So that, and I feel for my kids because they're kind of going through that now. And luckily they're older now. So this is, and but they had their trial run, I suppose, um, much earlier when my wife's father passed away, then my dad passed away, then my brother passed away, then my half sister passed away, and now it's like, and this is on their watch. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I already had a whole slew when I was growing up, when I was their age. So yeah, there's been it. Let's put it this way. To me, it feels like the last 10 years have been on some kind of accelerated streak, because I think in my own family, at least, let's see, one, two, 3 close family members died. Only one of them died in old age, if you will. But my brother
Mhm.
and my half brother and my half sister, they both died at a relatively young age. They died in their 50s.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so that's that. And then just having my kids kind of live through that, you know what I mean? It's tough, because I know um, kind of how it affected me, because when I was younger, like I said, my mom was a physician, and so probably for that reason, relatives would come to my house to basically pass away, and sometimes they lingered for a long time, like up to a year and a half. But luckily, my kids haven't quite had to go through anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just a little bit of a drag, because you know you're trying to move forward in life, and yet when you have the presence of someone who's dying, it's like constantly resurrecting the past.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And it's like,
Yeah.
my God, I'm trying to move forward, and yet the past is trying to tsunami my ass. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's just one of these energetic things, but I'm just going to put it out there because I know that a lot of people are afraid to talk about these things. They feel guilty, like, oh God, you know, am I really going to be relieved when so and so passes away? Yes. You know, it's not that simple. It's not a simple yes. It's a complex
Sure.
emotion,
Yeah.
but a lot of times there will be a yes somewhere mixed in there, unless you just had the most incredible relationship. But then that's another ball of wax, because then that no is, I would say, much more painful than any yes might be.
Yeah.
If I'm being clear.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that makes the grieving process so difficult, because like you said, there's so much guilt tied to it. Like,
Yeah.
am I a terrible person because I'm tired of taking care of someone else? And it's, you know, I think we each come into this world with different capacities, and some of us, you know, and this is also highlighting another interesting thing, which is there's many natures to initiation, but there seems to be two major ones, which is one is inwardly and the other is outwardly and relating to others and service. So even if in the last year you hadn't opened a single grimoire or stood in a single circle, so to speak, this process of magic and initiation and coming into attunement with the natural laws is always happening. It's always occurring. And it's up to us to find it and figure out where we are within that process, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you just said is almost like the little gate that just opened for our, our other topic, which is the occult and, magic or what have you. And it reminds me of, I listened to an interview with Robert Podgorski maybe about a week ago. And for some reason, this was one that I hadn't heard before. I sent you, it was the one I sent you the link for, the Lima News or whatever. But anyway, he was talking about these practices as being contra naturam. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And it's funny that he should say that, because, the alchemists also talked about alchemy as being contra naturam, like against nature. That people, I think you could argue that there's a side to these things that is going with nature, and then another side to them that is going against nature.
Yeah.
But the real paradox here is that in some ways, this act of going against nature, which is what I feel that my practice has been, in many ways, it has this aspect of going against nature, because I haven't been able to find anything in nature or anything necessarily rational that even begins to make sense of some of these experiences. So magic to me has become kind of like this irrationally rational approach to do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
of making sense of something that bothers me, but that I can't necessarily make sense of.
Yeah,
And
finding that
so,
sense of resolution is very important. Go ahead.
yeah. And so, on the one hand, we say that death is natural. Um, but then there's another side to it where if it's really that natural, then why do we have such a catastrophic response to it? You see?
Mm, yeah.
And I think a lot of magic is actually born in that catastrophic response.
Uh-huh.
Do you see what
Uh-huh.
I'm saying?
Uh-huh. Yeah. I'm picking up what you're putting down. And well, and it's also interesting because there's this contra natura um concept, but also, I mean, that raises 2 points to me. One, you mentioned how alchemists talked about their art as being like anti-nature, but at the same time, we have like one of the most famous alchemists, Paracelsus or Paracelsus, who said that the alchemist should strive to mimic nature and their craft. And that's the thing. That's the second point to me, which is can we go against nature? Because everything we are, everything we have, and everything we do is an aspect of nature.
Right.
To burn the world down would be an act of nature. Fire, so it's like it's hard to go against nature because you're using the laws and resources of nature in doing so.
Right. Have you ever heard of the band Love and Rockets?
I have not.
Okay, it's kind of like a cheesy goth post-punk type of band from the 80s. But
Okay.
that line, this line, it's something that's always been with me. You know, it's almost like a little saying. He says, "You you can't go against nature because when you do go against nature, that's part of nature too."
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I love punk, man. Punk is just such a powerful genre. They don't care, and they just they say what they want to say. I love that. But you mentioned it's also like sort of goth in theme as well, so I'll have to check that out.
Saying that though, I don't know if that brings us any closer to where we're trying to go or where we want to be. Just saying that it's all part of nature, to me, is not a very satisfactory
Sure.
response.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't find resolve in that. I think that's part of one of the things that honestly is unsettling about science and um, sorcery is there doesn't seem to be resolve at either end. Like the knife will keep cutting whatever it is that we find in half into something else. And then we'll keep calling those two halves something else. But when we put all those pieces back together, it just seems like some sort of like onion or parfait or something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you don't want to dwell too much on that fact,
Yeah.
you know? I think, and that's why I think magic, if anything, it's trying to create almost like a wormhole effect
Yes.
where, whether you want to call it gnosis, that comes through that little wormhole effect that just allows us to live with a little more awareness than we normally would.
Yeah.
You know?
I was just making a note there. Because that is one thing you mentioned gnosis, and that's one thing. Two things that we discussed was the other thing that we were talking about, which was Podgorski. I definitely want to go back into that, but also the nature of Gnosticism. And last night, you and I were talking along a certain line that was it was sort of an amalgam of like Gnosticism and Enochian philosophy or theory.
Yeah.
And that's interesting too, because your shirt also kind of reminds me of the grid sigil, as well, with all the different
Well,
alignments
I
and
was trying to go with something that would relate to these topics. Yes.
it's
So yes, it
perfect.
was intentional.
And what you said earlier, that it was a Cthulhu
Yeah, I
shirt.
don't know if you can see.
That is very interesting. Oh
But
yeah, the
there's the
elder
head.
sign.
See?
It's got the elder sign on there.
That's right.
That's excellent. So thanks for sharing that with us. That's where did you get that?
I think my wife found it somewhere and she was like, "Oh yeah, I think he'll like that." So, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, back to Podgorski. We were discussing the nature of Enochian philosophy and sort of how it might relate to the demiurge, and you sent me a hand-drawn image, which I very crudely recreated so that I can show our audience, because we're probably going to be referencing this. And so I want them to have something to reference. So you sent me, I don't know if I would call it an Enochian cosmogony or what, but it's this sort of framework here where you've sort of spelled and placed
Yeah.
everything out.
Yeah.
And this doesn't do, and you actually had 10 stars. I could only fit 8. I don't
That's
know if there was.
I wasn't really thinking in terms of a given number.
Okay. But yeah, so we have this map, this key here. Would you discuss that a little bit with us? Because my Enochian is so basic. My like the theory, the philosophy, the practice has been very, very rudimentary. So
Mhm.
I would love to learn more about this. So we start up here at the top with Iad,
Mhm.
or something like the demiurge, right
Actually,
here.
Madriax is the first
That's where we
principle.
should start. Okay, so, and you mentioned a sort of parallel with Pleroma and the
Mhm.
Madriax,
Right.
correct? So could
Yeah.
you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah. Well, before I think we go further, I should tell you that um, how I gleaned this image or information. It is a combination of basically two concepts, or a concept and a practice, or however you want to call it. So obviously part of that is from this book here, which I know we'll be talking about, and you've already talked about. But actually, there's something else that I wanted to mention, and this is a book that actually there's two books. They share some of this work, I think. So you could basically get either one, depending on what you were more interested in. I think the mystical heptarchy is considered more of an introductory work that deals
Okay.
with the heptarchical system of John Dee. And the other one is probably more familiar to people. That's the Great Table.
Mhm.
The Great Table is where most people kind of land, if you will, when they start getting into Enochian. That's by far the more familiar one, because the heptarchy system is more like a traditional Solomonic planetary angel magic. But it does have
Okay.
the rudiments of the Enochian system built into it for sure. So it is a way of getting into the system. It just doesn't have the unique grid stuff that you get into
Okay.
later.
So I guess, sorry, go ahead. Go. Were you
no,
going to
no,
say something else? Okay. So
I,
I guess we should take one brief step back, because sometimes I forget that the people watching these videos are watching them, and they out of interest, which means they sometimes don't even know what we're talking about. So very, 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 very briefly, Enochian is a system that a philosopher from the Victorian era,
Elizabethan
essentially, go ahead.
Elizabethan era.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, Victorian was way after that.
Mhm.
Elizabethan era. And it was essentially a mathematical system, right? That gave way to like a religiously philosophical system. Like I'm not even really sure how to express it, because to me, like there is the angelic aspect of it, but it seemed to be based on mathematics from what I could tell.
I call it Neoplatonism on steroids.
Okay.
Okay. In other words, it's an attempt to merge in Neoplatonism. If you read Proclus, it's very mathematical.
Sure.
It's basically an attempt to merge a a a a mystical Neoplatonic worldview with some of the latest Elizabethan emerging sciences like cartography, cryptography, map making, and things of that nature. It was an attempt to weld Neoplatonic, not just the mysticism, but the belief that because of these geometric relationships between mind and or nous and phenomena, you could actually influence phenomena through those linkages.
And does that relate to the sacred alignments?
Yes,
That concept? It
absolutely.
seems like it did. From I read Podgorski's work, and it a lot of it went over my head, but what some of what I did grasp was that that is sort of what that was relating to. So one of the things that we were talking about, John Dee and Edward Kelly got into communication with angelic spirits.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that we were discussing was the likelihood that perhaps these angelic spirits were actually something like the Grigori or the Watchers, like Semyaza and Azazel, instead of Mikael and angels like that. What?
Unless you want to go further back.
Okay, let's do that.
I think some of the most tantalizing hints are found in the work of a scholar named Andrei Orlov.
Okay.
Now, he teaches at an American university, and he specializes in the Book of Enoch and what's also called the Slavonic Book of Enoch, which people say, oddly, is one of the oldest translations of the Book of Enoch, because the Slavonic translation was made from one of the oldest, now lost, extant scripts of the Book of Enoch. Does that make sense? So, in other words, like the later Latin translations or Greek or what have you, they're actually from an older copy than the Slavonic manuscript, which is unusual because Slavonic is considered a younger language.
Right.
But for whatever reason, you get these weird historical anomalies. And so he's done a lot of work on, I guess, what you might call dark angelology as it existed in the early Israelite or Hebrew tradition. This is temple and pre-temple mythology. This has nothing to do with later rabbinical Judaism. Okay, this is when Judaism wasn't even anything that would be recognizable to us, where the Judaism that he's talking about probably had more in common with something like Zoroastrianism.
Okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
There was a temple, a mystical priesthood. In the temple, they practiced kind of esoteric rites. There was a whole very sophisticated temple complex that was arranged to planetary motions and to a whole, I guess you could call it magical, mythological structure. Just more along the lines of like a really ancient religion, like Babylonian, Sumerian religion, that kind of thing, where you had deities that combined qualities of dark and light, or you had dark deities and then light deities, and they were involved in some kind of like conflict with one another. And so he studies this kind of layer of the Hebrew Bible, and especially the Book of Enoch, where this kind of worldview is like more openly discussed.
Yeah.
And I have to say that there's something about Enochian that seems to resonate with that kind of thing. Okay. there's something about it that does seem to resonate with these older liturgically based traditions, whether they're Gnostic or they are Sumerian, pardon me, or like I said, or Enochian. You know, after all, the Book of Enoch. And this is the interesting thing, is that I don't even know if Dee had access to the Book of Enoch. All he had access to was the legend of Enoch, as it is just briefly mentioned in the canonical scriptures. But all of the Enoch lore and all of the stuff in the pseudo-epigrapha, I don't think that was available to Dee. It either was lost somewhere in the dusty libraries of the East, or it was something that was even rediscovered by archaeologists in a more recent time period.
That makes me wonder, like, are myths the only truth? Because it seems like symbolism and iconography unlock something within our consciousness. And it seems like we tell stories about the icons and the images. And that's what gets encoded, and that's what gets recorded. But the fact that that cultures can come up with the same concepts, like cross globally, is something that's always interested me. And along with that is this concept that we're sort of touching on as well, which is like this, what do you call it? Like just a spirituality that includes spectrum within it. Because like this day and age, everything's so dualistic. But I've always had this feeling like there were like infernal angels and something like celestial demons, because things aren't just black and white. And somewhere along the way, I don't know, there's this like cross-pollination or something happening that doesn't really get talked about a lot these days.
I think those are all very crucial points. And I don't think Enochian resolves the issue of dark versus light or good versus evil.
Sure.
But it certainly demonstrates that our current understanding of these things are inadequate and insufficient. It deepens the problem, it complicates the problem, it doesn't resolve the problem. If that makes sense. But it does point to very creative ways with which one can deepen one's understanding of what is involved. It's one of those systems that's full of so many interesting threads that you have to be careful in choosing what aspect of it do you really want to pursue.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Just briefly going back to that image, I just wanted to show that there's a ritual here, which I have to give a lot of credit to, because it's basically an Enochian version of the middle pillar exercise.
You're talking about this image?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And this image was inspired by a ritual or an energy exercise out of this book.
I see the middle pillar, or I see the middle pillar in the LBRP.
Yeah.
And that's very, very interesting.
So this is a more complex image than just the middle pillar, because this is a combination of the grid sigil as well as the energy exercise, the Enochian middle pillar, if you will, from this book here. And those two things combined, and plus just a little bit of my own background thinking about what this means from a Gnostic point of view and what this might mean from a Hermetic and sort of like biblical point of view. And I think all those aspects come into play in that image, and that doing this ritual along with the grid work is very, very powerful.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Because if the grid is laying things out on a more horizontal plane, and it's not limited to the horizontal, but this other ritual really activates the vertical part.
Exactly.
Okay. And that's the one thing about Enochian is you always have to understand how the vertical and the horizontal are constantly interpenetrating.
Well, and that's perfect too, because another thing that you've mentioned, I asked you the other day what you think the Enochian energy and force might be. And you expressed at the time that it seems to be something like the meta system, I think, is how I would sort of condense everything that you said. It seemed like you were expressing it as sort of the system behind all of the systems. Yeah, is that something that we could talk about?
I've actually changed my view of that.
Okay.
I've now come to the belief that kind of like how postmodernism shows that every ideology is a screen for yet another ideology for yet another ideology. There's an element to Enochian where you don't want to become paranoid or obsess over the idea, but you kind of, and I think it'll happen naturally to anyone who plays with the system, is that this system will present itself in these veils that are meant to be transcended. Okay, so you'll have a belief about what it is and how it works, but over time that belief will disintegrate, or it will kind of blow away or blow apart to reveal something else. Okay, and each time it happens, the structure becomes more complex, more fascinating, more bizarre, if you will. So I can't tell you exactly. I will say that there is an element to the system that functions very similar to the way that we think about technology, especially digital technology.
Yes.
Where we think in terms of a code, and we think in terms of commands that are sent in these information bytes, and that there's a very strong reciprocity between the code and then the thing that gets spit out at the other end. Okay?
Right.
And people look at the Enochian system, oh, it's like a 3D printer from the Renaissance, from the Middle Ages, you know. Well, yeah. I mean,
that's the physical, that's the shell of it.
Yeah. Yes, you could say that, but that also shows us the bankruptcy of our own ideas, because now we tend to see everything in terms of mechanistic code. Okay. And so it's not necessarily telling us what this is. It's just saying that, you know, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay. Because we're in this digital world. So we want to see code everywhere we look. And we think it's such a compliment to say that something resembles code. And maybe it's not such a compliment.
Well, it's very egocentric toward humanity too, that we take everything and we filter it back through our own perception.
Exactly.
Well, another thing is this systems like the Enochian system, or even just in general, it seems to me it seems so much about taking the physicality of it all, like the ring, like the sigil, like the table, and absorbing it, disseminating it into our being. And once you begin to visualize this stuff, once you begin to actually like use something like Dharana or Dhyana, or Tantra, like we were speaking earlier.
Yeah.
You take the primordial ooze of your empty tohu bohu astral being.
Yeah.
And you give it form and you give it force.
Yeah.
And you are creating a sort of genesis within your own being. And I think that's why so many traditions, like especially in Buddhism, like they have something that is like the generation meditation, which is they literally are building level by level like a ziggurat or a temple.
Yeah.
And then they're casting wards and nets over it.
Yeah.
Well, that's having an effect.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder how much the table and the sigil and the ring and all of these things are meant to be transformative and internally instead of being directed outwardly.
Thank you. Okay. Because this is exactly what I think we should be talking about as one of the key aspects to this system. The way you mentioned that a lot of tantric work has to do with like building up the Buddhists have these various terms, the Sambhogakaya body, this
Nirmanakaya, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That it's a kind of esoteric, magical, shamanic, inner sort of like whether you want to call it an inner empowerment, an inner archetypal identification or co-creation. This is basically the Tibetan deity practice where eventually the practitioner, quote unquote, becomes the deity. And there's this constant alchemical movement back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's and then until the two just kind of merge together.
Well, and sorry, I was just going to briefly mention, you mentioned the shamanic nature of these practices, and even Buddhism, I believe, can be traced back to Bonpo or Bonpo, which is a form of
tradition for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, and so I think you have to, if you're going to work with this seriously, you do have to realize that there is that, again, whether you want to call it tantric or even Kabbalistic, in the Kabbalistic Hermetic tradition, it was the Adam Kadmon meditation. Okay. Well, you have to realize that all the aspects of the Enochian system don't just relate to the outer cosmos, but they also absolutely relate to the inner cosmos, and that the magician, quote unquote, becomes or awakens the great table within in all various permutations, or the ethers, or even the heptarchy, that these all have like inner tantric aspects. And in fact, you should probably keep that in mind and even understand that that's going to be the primary level of your experience, at least initially.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny
people's mileage may vary, of course, but that's just something that I've come to understand after a while. That Enoch, if you think that Enoch maybe is more connected to the system than you think, okay?
Right.
And Enoch then becomes Metatron.
Right. Yes.
Okay. And Enoch is also said to have been originally a man who ascended without dying to heaven. Only one of two people in history, according to the ancient Hebrew Bible. Okay. Elijah being the second. So I would say that even Elijah has a certain resonance with this system, that there's kind of this idea there that Enochian is related somehow to whatever Enoch himself experienced.
Witnessed, yeah, and experienced, yeah.
Okay. Whatever shamanic, mystical, temple based thing that he experienced, or that even these ancient prophets, as a rule, experienced something somewhat similar to this, at least on some level.
Right.
I would say, yeah, that it does relate to that. That with this system, it does go to that. I hesitate to call it a dark place because it's also a light place, but it's definitely that numinous place, in the sense of like a potentially terrifying place that is both dark and light somehow simultaneously. I'm referring to that, that sort of shamanic type of transformation that some people might say, well, the closest analog to that might be the near-death experience.
Uh-huh.
That it is something along those lines. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen to you, but I tell you that I mentioned this, I think, the last time we talked, that yeah, I did have an early, quote unquote, accidental experience with this system where I was like, whoa, okay, this is scary. Like, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Now, the system, I think, is set up with a lot of different safeguards. All that complexity is a safeguard. And I went in there with a kind of completely accidental approach, but I think I got a taste of potentially what lurks inside this system. Okay, that somehow it is a repository of very intense psychological or spiritual or ecstatic numinous type experiences. I think they can be generated quite intensely with this system.
But doesn't that almost inherently make the table and the sigil like a reliquary of sorts? For you mentioned that it was like a repository. I mean,
I think that's a very interesting point. I really, really do. And it's got that quality to it.
because I noticed, here's how I approached Enochian. I heard about the Ciceros talking about it. Many people are familiar with them.
Mm-hmm.
Many people probably aren't. But I was reading the Self-Initiation into the Golden Dawn green brick book. And at some point, it goes into Enochian. And I'm like, I don't know anything about any of this. I'm going to approach it very mildly. I'm just going to vibrate some of the names. I'm just going to daily intone, the spirit. Like, basically, there were 5 names that I was intoning every single day, and things started happening.
Yeah, that could get weird for sure. Depending
Then
on the names that you were using, but yeah.
It was, I don't want to just like light people's ears up, but it was basically spirit of spirit, spirit of fire, spirit of water, spirit of earth. I was by intoning those 5 names.
Yeah. You're safer actually with the higher registers, I think.
I thought so.
Yeah.
So then just getting back to the reliquary idea, then I purchased and inscribed Sigillum de Emet. And then I started holding this, which it was like inscribed on a piece of black slate. So that's another thing in and of itself. But then I would hold on to this sigil while I was vibrating these names after like a month. And then the first time I did it, I started having visions.
Yeah.
And I hadn't experienced any visions for a month while intoning these names. So that immediately made me think, well, okay, this is a key of sorts.
Yeah.
That's a rudimentary way of thinking about it, but that was my first experience. And then I made a table. I made a great table and colored it in, actually drew the letters and everything like that, and was constantly having visions. during the process of creating this table. I mean, it was like weird visions. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to become, it was like they were completely bereft of my ego, these visions. I was not even existent. The earth was not even existent in most of these visions,
Yeah.
which made me start to beg for information on what this system is, because primarily I experienced it as a technology, very synthetic intelligence or artificial intelligence oriented, or very alien. That was
Yeah.
initially how I experienced it.
Yeah.
But then the more I started to interact with it, it was like the circuits warmed up or
Yeah.
something, or
Yeah.
like I was allowed deeper into the machine or
Hmm.
something, and
Yeah.
it was less cold and it was more alive at that
Yeah.
point. Once I
Right.
actually had the symbolism building within myself, it was like I warmed up the machine or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I totally agree. I would I that's a really, really great way of putting it, because I would say the same experience somehow happened to me as well. But for me, it was actually the grid sigil that helped.
Okay, facilitate that.
Yeah, it did something to those energies and made them more compatible for me. Because I have found that Enochian instruments, the traditional instruments, don't necessarily resonate that well for me. And
Hmm.
I find that the grid sigil is a much better interface for me than the instruments, except for the table.
The table.
And by that I mean the great table. I don't mean the
Uh-huh.
Enochian table.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I don't do that well with the tools for whatever reason. At least not, maybe later, maybe, I don't know. But I have played with them in the past, and I've always found that when I use more implements, it feels cold and it feels artificial to me.
Right, right. Yeah.
And it was really with the grid sigil that the whole system, as you say, warmed up for me.
Mm. Yeah. So how did how did you go about working with it? Did you redraw the grid sigil on like a separate piece of paper and use it as like a focus for yantra, or was it more like you were using it to scry on, or was it like you were actually creating other sigils with it to work with? How, what was your experience with the grid sigil?
It was basically two things. One, it was starting to read Podgorski and this book as a grimoire
Uh-huh.
rather than as just a text or even a very informative text. In other words, thinking, reading it very closely and really taking the time to ponder the meaning of every statement. And because it became clear to, and you know what? This is not my first pass with the book. I think I bought the book when it first came out, which was like 6 years ago,
Hmm.
at least.
Hmm.
Um, and when I first got it, it went way over my head.
Right.
And I actually had to put it down. And then we moved several times and ended up in storage. And then I bought another copy
Hmm.
maybe about a year ago. And I've been working from that copy. And now
Interesting.
we brought the stuff back from storage, and now my old copy has just shown up within the last couple of months. So it's like they the two copies met each other.
That is such a metaphor.
Yeah,
That like the fact that you were working out of a sort of proxy,
yeah,
it, is such a metaphor for this whole system to me, because there's some, I can't shake the feeling of the fact that the Enochian spirits aren't angels. That that was just filtered through the perspective of the Elizabethan era. Because I think if people like John Dee would have been talking about these spirits and the way that they perhaps were actually experiencing them, they would have been thought of as crazy or heretics.
yeah,
So it just makes me wonder, that in and of itself is a proxy. Like they they created a proxy for the actual spirits, perhaps, and called them angels, or celestial beings in some instances. But what the hell does that even mean?
What I found with this is that you need some kind of overall philosophical and conceptual framework. You need
Sure,
some lattice work to hold on to.
sure.
Now, my advice is don't make it a super rigid structure.
Uh-huh.
Make it something that could be adjusted over time or evolve or whatever. Don't say, this is what it is and that's it. No. But you do need some kind of cohesive framework, I think, in order to work with this system. And I have found that for me, the best framework is not to go in the direction, well, okay, I just contradicted myself. And that's one thing I do need to reiterate about this system, okay, is its polarity.
Sure.
It has a push-pull quality.
Right.
That, if you want to call it an oscillation, okay, and that oscillation is what makes it so powerful, so dynamic, and so difficult to pin down, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And each person, your framework will have to somehow accommodate the nature of this oscillation. You're not going to be able to explain it, but you're going to need some way of dealing with it because it's going to happen. This pendulum thing that it does, or dilation. It's in other words, you're going to need to deal with the paradoxical nature of this system.
Yeah.
And I've since become aware of its very ancient antecedents as well as oddly postmodern and even post-technological aspects. And the system can kind of glide between those two extremes. And you can perceive it in either of those two ways or in some kind of weird gestalt. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is why Podgorski's system was so crucial for me, because it's these lines, okay, that connect the air quadrant with the fire quadrant, and then this wormhole thing here.
Yeah, right, yes.
Okay. And Podgorski himself says this is probably the most profound part of the sigil itself.
Uh-huh.
And this represents the odd time dilating and non-Euclidean nature of the Enochian system. And he says that this quadrant is technically the seat of the magician.
That makes sense.
So the magician operates from the air element.
Mm-hmm.
The water element is here, the earth element is here, and the fire element is here. But this whole thing kind of represents the Enochian system. It's really a kind of shorthand for this, as well as a depiction of its energies. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that I was trying to express when we were talking last night, was how much the grid sigil seems to be practical in its formation, as opposed to just philosophical. Because a lot of glyphs rather, and sigils and icons, they are drawn in a way to represent something. But the grid sigil, when you look at it, it's actually doing what it's showing.
Yes.
That's
it's
that
like a
in and of itself it breaks the fourth wall. I don't know.
It does. Oh no, this is like a 5-dimensional tool. I don't know what you want to call it. But it is unprecedented. Okay. I don't think too many people are quite ready for what it's doing, but the possibility's already there.
Yeah.
And the thing about this sigil is it allows you to begin to integrate the so-called angelic and qliphothic nature of Enochian right away in a way that doesn't necessarily overload your circuits, if that makes
That's it does. Well, and you just mentioned another thing that I wanted to get into, which was like I had mentioned the proxy idea, and you mentioned like the Enochian antecedents. And that is something that I've been getting into a lot over the last year is the same thing with the Qliphothic idea is like, if you look back, the idea of the Qliphoth is not new. It's not Hebrew in origin. It might be most venerated in that tradition, but if you look, you can find this idea of something like celestial beings interacting and guiding humanity. And the converse of that, the underworld traditions that have run through cultures and time. But this idea that something is reaching out or reaching in, um, it's cross-cultural and it's as old as time. And I'm trying to figure out what's behind it. I want to get to the bottom of it because there seems to have always, I mean, if we look at the Dogon tribe, and they talk about people literally coming from the stars, or if we talk about um, like angels like guiding us, there's always been something like that. Shamanically, it's been ancestors and the rainbow serpent, potentially DNA encrypted information that is being activated through ritual.
Yeah.
There seems to be some truth to this as far as the soul goes. And I think there's a powerful thing in recognizing it cross traditionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think the whole grid sigil is a game changer, and I
Yeah.
think there's also something about the Enochian system where it is somehow very active in ever since it was quote unquote received. I think it's been interfacing with culture and civilization in very weird and anomalous ways.
Do you think it's connecting through our astral interpretations and our philosophical interpretations? Like like the so-called Enochian system exists, like the cyberplane existed before we put the internet on it.
That's an interesting question. I don't know how it this is being done or what exactly is behind it. Um, all I can say is that Enochian, especially as represented by the grid sigil,
Mm-hmm.
is very much part of our current collective egregore or aeon or what have you. That whatever paroxysms that the world is going through right now seem to be intimately related to motifs that are found in the Enochian system and ideas that or insights that people have while working with this system. And then when you add the grid sigil to that, it just takes things to an entirely different level. And
Right.
it seems to be somehow deeply intertwined with this very strange historical moment that we're going through, this surreal, hallucinatory, and yet also deeply troubling, deeply apocalyptic time that we're going through. Okay. Whether you see what I'm saying? So I'm talking about history and politics.
Right.
The grid sigil is somehow vibrating with the history and the politics. Okay. Coming from the past and also moving into this unknown space, this singularity type deal
Right.
thing. Okay. And it's almost as if, are we being projected from the singularity or are we moving towards the sig and
Or
into
both.
that's right. There's your dilation effect.
Uh-huh.
You see what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
If you okay, so that's just a small example of the kinds of weird energies that we're having, and our society now has broken down into a what some parapsychologists call, not only they call it high strangeness, but they also call it this period of like a post-truth era or extreme reflexivity, where um, fact or history and fiction are no longer clearly distinguishable, where the news and a movie are no longer distinguishable. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You see the news and it's like, wait, is this the latest George Romero or is this actually happening? You know what I mean? I don't know if you've been watching that New Jersey drone shit. Okay.
Uh-uh.
But there is footage from the like high level congressional meetings. And it literally sounds like a bad 80s sci-fi, where in the movie, the bad 80s version is you've got a bunch of ham actors in a fake Congress, and they're getting all in an uproar over some mysterious things flying around.
Uh-huh.
Okay? That the scientists have picked up anomalous objects in the skies. Well, guess what? That's what this is. But this is actually real. Okay?
Yeah.
And so we're entering this kind of anomalous time period where it's almost like the imagination is starting to kind of somehow bleed into reality.
Uh-huh.
Do you know what I
Yes.
mean? There's a
Yes.
cross contamination that's occurring anyway, and that's what a lot of Enochian is about. It's about the odd, porous and sort of the fluid kind of boundaries between things, you know?
It makes me think of Yog-Sothoth. This inner penetrating consciousness that is ingesting everything and then like regurgitating and spewing it out like in a different way. And that's sort of what I mean about like it being influenced by our astral or or philosophical connection and understanding with it, because my interaction with the grid sigil and my interaction with Enochian, it seems to change over time in a way that is different than other systems. Like when I practice other systems, I can tell that it's changing over time because of my philosophy and my perspective is changing. When I work with the Enochian system, I can tell it's like, oh my God, this is perfect metaphor. It's like I'm loading a save file to a game that somebody else has played on since me.
I'll stop you there because that analogy flies over my head because I'm
Okay.
not of the gaming generation.
Okay, so imagine you were writing a story in a book, and then somebody else picks up the book and starts writing in the book, and then you go back to finish your story, but something else has happened to it.
Yeah.
And it's not just your perspective that has changed. There has been an infiltration, or there has been an evolution that has happened since I last interacted with it, I guess is what I'm getting at.
And I will make another nerd analogy and say that yes, there also seems to be a kind of open source quality to Enochian.
Yes.
Where
Well said.
anybody who works with it, their work is somehow automatically sucked into the system and it becomes part of it. You know, like the Borg.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, how the Borg, they siphon and then that becomes a subcubicle of the larger system. Okay. Now notice the Borg also. I mean, come on. You can't deny that there are certain parallels. So yes. So for example, since Crowley worked with the system, since Podgorski worked with the system, whatever they've done has already been assimilated by the system,
Right.
and it becomes part of it. And I think it's not insignificant because I think whatever that assimilation that's taking place, that's somehow altering our reality in a much deeper in a much more fundamental way than I think we would even want to know. I don't think
Right.
we would. We would have trouble sleeping, I think, if we really knew the extent of this. Okay. Enochian's one of those things where it's not really limited by anything except what you're actually willing to find out or to discover. And
Wow. Yeah.
the real question is, you ask yourself, do I really want to know this? That, if you know, it's not can it or will it. Oh, it can and it will. But the question is, do you want to know? And and you may not be able to control what you receive. You may not be able to put a lid on it. And it may be that, you know, it's too much. It's too much for
Right.
you to handle. So
it makes me wonder what happens with all the excess psychic energy that isn't absorbed with an experience like that. Like, does the system just eat it back up, or does it sit in our akasha, so to speak, just waiting to be absolved? Like, what?
Okay, there is a very composting side to it as well. There's a eating,
yes,
and a digesting, and a breaking down, and then a thing that it does. And that's why I think there are two calls to spirit. There's the first call and the second call, because they each represent those oscillating poles.
Very, very, very interesting. That's very profound.
One is active,
yes,
and that's the first call, but the other one is digestive,
and passive.
Second call. Okay.
Whoa. I wonder if there's a relationship to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.
Sure.
I'm going to have, next time I do the calls, I'm going to have to watch what's happening between, because like we do see that even outside of the Enochian system with like the LBRP and stuff like that, because like there is spirit active and spirit passive.
I tend to see it as solve and coagula.
Sure. And I love that approach. Yeah. Very interesting.
The second call has more of a coagula quality to it.
I could see that.
Validating.
Yeah, the one like sort of is like subliminatory. It's very effervescent, so that you can sort of rise to the occasion, so to speak. But then the other one is sort of, as you mentioned, coalescing and conglomeratory or coagulative. That's very interesting. I'm not even sure. Like, it's like I knew that, but I don't know I ever brought it down far enough to be able to express it.
Exactly.
Very interesting. Well, do you mind if we take like a 5-minute intermission so that we can grab a drink of water and stretch and then come back?
Yeah,
I think we still have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we are back. We were discussing the grid sigil and the nature of its formation. And one thing that I found interesting was that it seems to be something of an auto, I think it's called an autostereogram, which is one of those paintings or images that when you look at, something pops out of it. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those before.
Is there like you mean like there's a hologram in it or something to that effect?
Yeah, there's some sort of hologram or image that you look through it and it turns 3D.
Ah, okay. And
Linda Filorio's Shadow Tarot seems to have that quality about it as well.
You do know that this guy's knows Linda Filorio quite well, and a number of her cards are in this book.
Yes, so I didn't know that he knew that he had known her very well, but that makes sense. Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, go on.
So I just thought it was interesting that these images are set up that way because it leads me to interact with them in a different way. Because before I had experienced the grid sigil or the shadow tarot cards, my practice was very different.
Mhm.
I was less involved. And when I it's like these symbols pull me out of myself, is
Mhm.
what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
Because you have to interact with them. It's not like it's not like a machine that you just twist up and set to the side and then it does its dance or it sings its song. It very much becomes a part of you and you become a part of it. And you mentioned that it's like a flight simulator. I guess
Yeah.
that's your way, I guess, of expressing what I'm trying to express is like there's this magnetic, would you call it a magnetic quality to it? I guess I would.
Definitely. I'm just going to shut a window here.
Hmm.
It's it it's 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 something that is paradoxical, and it's meant to be paradoxical.
Right.
It's meant to be non-Euclidean, as
Right.
H.P. Lovecraft used to say all the time. About
Mhm.
weird angles, and
Mhm.
that's what this is. This is the bizarre non-Euclidean mathematics of H.P. Lovecraft. And in fact, there's a distinct Lovecraftian theme that
Absolutely.
okay, and Podgorski fully acknowledges the Lovecraftian nature of the grid sigil. Okay, so anyone doing Lovecraftian work is going to be enjoying this, and they'll also realize that yeah, Enochian has a Lovecraftian dimension as
Yes.
well as a Qliphothic or Typhonian side to it as well.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and the grid sigil, like I said, it helps you integrate all of those very alien and non-standard energies and concepts, at least for our civilization. These things may very well be quite normal to some, you know, race of Lovecraftian beings. That's fine. That may be perfectly normal for them. In fact, that's what Lovecraft himself talked about. Okay,
Yeah.
it's only it's rearranging for our senses and our consciousness, because it is coming from somewhere else. Um,
Hmm.
and so I do think that there is that element of maybe we wouldn't call it an alien artifact per se, but it's heading in
Right.
that direction. And
Yeah.
you know, it's alien artifact adjacent, as they say.
Yeah.
Uh, and it can certainly put you in touch with things that seem to kind of resonate on that level. In other words, yeah, whatever you want to call it, the non-human, the alien, yeah. But I just feel that those terms are inadequate.
Sure. I do
It's
too.
you know it's just giving us a bigger picture of probably even ourselves, because you see what I'm saying? It's like, in order to perceive something, it's already has to be there on some
Hmm.
level.
Hmm.
Okay, so whatever the grid sigil is showing us is already part of who we are.
I think so too.
I don't see how we could perceive it if it wasn't already part of us on some level.
Yeah. Right. 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 Exactly. And that's like uh, drugs come to mind.
Yeah.
When someone smokes cannabis, that high wouldn't be there if the so-called cannabinoid receptors weren't there to receive and interact with it. There's something within our being that the grid sigil seems to tickle or elevates or highlight, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And there is something about the non-Euclidean geometries that bring out the color from space.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
exactly. The, That's a great way of putting it. And there's something uniquely objective about the grid sigil.
Mm.
That I think that for me has been um, a gradual realization. And it's not, again, it's not something that I want to fix in stone, but there is a very interesting quality, and the more you work with it, the more dynamic it becomes. Okay, the more multi manifest it becomes, and yeah, I guess you could say the more objective it becomes. I guess that's why I use the term alien artifact, because an
I
artifact
love it.
is, we think of that as something objective.
Mm.
And so there is this quality of it. Like, what was this, like an inscription on the wall of some cave in some, like but it's like on some distant planet in some distant galaxy, you know what I mean? It's got that quality to it. It's got the quality of a cave inscription.
Well, but then I mean, it could be an inscription in an ancient cave.
Yeah,
Like, as
there's
in
no
our
reason
brain,
why not.
our what do you call this, cranium, our skull, you know, that I often wonder how much are we privy to? Like, if there were some type of inscription in some long forgotten cave in another galaxy, like, it is emanating a frequency vibrationally.
Yeah.
And I am something like a receptor that receives impulses and impressions. So can that cave painting turn into a cave painting in my cave? I don't know. That, to me, that's deeply fascinating, because it makes me wonder where all of this is coming from. Is it just symbolism from the laws of physics that, oh, this is how us stupid humans are supposed to understand it, or is it coming from somewhere?
Well, I'll give you two possible answers. I mean, they're both somewhat humorous, I think. Um, one is Ridley Scott's Prometheus.
I
You know,
love it. Yeah.
this reminds me, if you've seen that movie, um, and they find those inscriptions in the cave walls, and then they find the so-called architects and the guidance system and their cartography and all, and basically the technology of those Nephilim type beings is very reminiscent of how the grid
Absolutely.
can feel.
One thing that's very, I guess, relevant to this, I can't remember if it was Prometheus or not, but there is a scene in one of those films where the simulacrum, the sort of bridge between the Nephilim race and the humans, was something of like an android, and he was like, Michael Fassbender played him, whatever that character is. There was a scene where,
Oh, yes.
can
Okay.
you briefly explain what Michael Fassbender's character was? Like, the go ahead.
All I understood is that he is some super sophisticated AI drone or robot, basically.
Right. So, but there's a scene where he comes into contact with a later model of himself, and he teaches himself to play a song on a
Okay, that's
flute.
not Prometheus. That's the one that came after Prometheus.
Okay, it was one of the,
Yeah,
that
I don't have
scene
as good of.
gave that scene gave me chills for
Yeah,
days,
yeah, yeah.
because the nature of the, I mean, one synthetic intelligence teaching another, either a cousin or a son. I mean, that seems to be the song of the century, so to speak. And that's what all of this seems to be about. This whole Enochian thing, like this grid, the sacred alignments, like, they do seem like they come from somewhere else or somewhen else.
I agree, and I think another interesting consideration is to also look at this grid sigil as a kind of evolution of Christianity, evolution of the cross, of the symbol of the
Yeah.
cross. Okay,
Huh.
because that's still there, you know.
But even Christianity was an evolution of, obviously,
Well,
of
right,
other
right,
things.
and now you've just added quantum physics to the image of the cross.
Man, man. So, yeah. So then, so what does one do with all of this? I mean, here we are. It's basically 2025, and there's this idea of this alien artifact. I mean, so now what? Like, what next?
Are you referring to the artifact as the grid sigil, or are you referring to like the whole UAP phenomenon?
No, I'm talking about like the grid sigil and the Enochian system as being an artifact potentially.
It certainly behaves like one.
It
And
does.
whether it was retrieved out of deep inner space or deep outer space,
Right. Well
I
said.
don't know. And I don't even, I actually would suggest that probably because of when you work with this, you realize that there really is no difference.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And if there is, I'm not sure it matters to a large degree, you
Yeah.
know. Man. So yeah, so I love the idea. I love the concept of it being an artifact because that also suggests that it's a fragment to some degree.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I honestly don't know. Um, I think there's an aspect to it that is suggestive of the fact that it is both a part and a whole
Hmm.
because of the way the lines extend.
Right. Yeah.
It it has boundaries, but yet it exceeds those boundaries at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it gives that feeling of a very thin edge of a very large wedge.
It's like
Um,
eternity and infinity mixed together somehow,
mhm.
you know. And he spends a lot of time offering the reader different ways to think about this. How can you have both eternity and infinity, or time and space, depicted as quote unquote an image, but yet an image that isn't just a static graphic representation,
Mm.
but yet somehow, um, I don't know what the word is, contains its own intelligence or behaves intelligently, or I don't know. I really I struggle, and I think all of our ideas about users and user interfaces, and the subject and the object, and the maker and the made, that all of these concepts are challenged by
Mhm.
this. Even the most sophisticated sort of postmodern analyses of language, and the notion of the sound and the predicate and all this stuff, I don't think they even really begin to come close to what the grid sigil is and what it is doing.
Well, sorry to interrupt. I just now I'm thinking about the idea of the relationship between the dreamer, the dream, and the act of dreaming itself,
Yeah,
and its relation to this. But then I'm reminded of our previous discussion. We spoke briefly of Castaneda and this concept of the stalker or the hunter.
I was
And
just about to say Castaneda. You beat me
so
to it.
there we
Yeah,
go. There we go.
yeah,
So then that's also the oscillation.
yeah,
Like there's the hunter and the dreamer, and then there's the hunting and the dreaming, and then there's the dream. So there's this like oscillation happening. And
yeah,
like we can go in at any point and come out another one. Yeah.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
what were you gonna mention about
I
Castaneda? Go
was
ahead.
just going to say probably one of the closer analogs to the kind of um, cosmology, if you will, the kind of like the kinds of physics that exist or that are suggested by the grid sigil would be something like tantric Buddhism.
Sure. Uh-huh.
or shamanism, or like shamanistic, um, um, the way, shamans kind of viewed reality.
Mhm.
And again, Castaneda absolutely falls into that same category. That whatever the grid sigil is representing, it's both resonating with, quantum physics, if you will, but also this tantric worldview, the tantric Buddhist, if you will, worldview, which is it's tough to put into words, because it's a using words like non-dual, without a full indoctrination in Buddhist dogmatics. That word is nonsensical to most people, myself included. But I can tell you that there's there's an intuitive similarity between those systems, the way they view inner and outer, the way they view dream and dreamer, all of these dichotomies, which are have porous boundaries, essentially.
Right.
They're interpenetrating, and how a symbol is both a symbol and the thing itself. Okay, like the way the shaman believes that the doll is a surrogate for the thing itself, or in a way is the thing itself, and thus whatever it is can be trapped in the doll, whatever. But it's got that kind of quality in it. It's got that kind of shamanistic or animistic element to it, because animism suggests that objects also partake of the world's soul. Okay.
Right.
And I think the grid sigil shows that just to a more extraordinary degree, that it
Uh-huh.
shows us that, hey, equations might just be alive, especially when they're represented like this, okay, in a way that allows us to perceive them on that level.
Man, and the fact that the idea of an equation being alive, I'm not sure if I want to go on to this tangent or not, but I'm thinking like equations are alive in a lot of ways because in some places and times,
Excuse me.
you're okay. And in some places and times, maybe 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2,
Exactly.
which makes me think about all of the realities where 1 + 1 does equal 2. Like that's an entire, maybe not wormhole, but like that's an entire cell within reality. And so the equations are alive in that way as well, because from cell to cell of reality, mathematically, the same equation is evolving. 1 + 1 = 1, 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 3, and so on. Yeah, the equations are alive in that sense as well. And I'm not sure what a reality where 1 + 1 = 1 would look like, but it's certainly out there, I would think. You know.
Well, I think 1 + 1 = 2 until it doesn't. Okay.
Right.
And excuse me, I I took an overenthusiastic gulp. Um, I think this behaves like well, whether you want to call it like a genie's lamp,
Mm-hmm.
but a deeper understanding of a genie's lamp that doesn't have to be superstitious, because we've already noticed, parapsychology has already discovered that despite the fact that our universe seems to follow very, very linear modes of progression, there are things that exist on the so-called fringes
Mm-hmm.
of our experience and of our even of our physical universe, where this logical progression begins to break down.
Right.
When you start getting to things like, nuclear science, you start getting to things like of extreme temperatures, you start getting to extreme technological.
And that's exactly what I'm getting at is even within our own reality, there are places, pockets,
Yeah.
quantum,
Synchronicities.
Kelvin levels where the equations break down. And
Yeah.
when I perceive that visually, it's like a tie-dye Swiss cheese.
Yeah.
And when I think about reality and nature that way, I mean that's weird.
Yeah, exactly. I think the term wormhole is an interesting concept related to Enochian. I think
Well,
that obviously you can see that there's a number of things that can be considered wormholes, but he actually brings attention. This design continues on the other side, and there's actually one more here. Okay, and he brings attention to this. Okay,
right.
and that's the mother of all wormholes. There's okay, the grid sigil itself emerges out of that wormhole. And so
Right.
our universe itself emerged out of a pre-existing wormhole. So
right.
So we ourselves are a wormhole with our own wormholes that have emerged out of a larger wormhole.
Yes. And that's I guess what I was trying to poke at earlier when I was talking about the nature of proxies. Because I mean it's just everywhere when it comes to this Enochian stuff. And it's also interesting, the term wormhole. Worm, the word worm has some connotation relation to dragons.
Of course.
I'm not sure what, I think the Enochian word for dragon is like Vovine or something like that.
Yes.
So yeah, like the and you know, like the dragon lines,
and
the
the
ley
temples
lines.
of Set have a lot to do with
Yes,
wormholes.
exactly.
Termite
Yeah.
tunnel.
So and then now we're getting into the relationship between the Qliphoth and the Aethers. And if they're even, is that part of the oscillation?
I think so. I think so. And I think you end up contacting other dimensions of this system even while you're working within fairly strict and focused guidelines. So you can be working in a focused manner on one part of the system and you'll still get bleed through.
Right.
At least that's been my experience. And I don't know if there's a way to prevent that from happening.
Perhaps, but I've experienced it as well.
Yeah. And
it would probably take a very deep level of psychological warding and hypnosis to prevent the two systems from, because I mean that's what part of what our being does, is it coagulates.
Yeah.
So there would probably have to be a deep level of intention or hypnosis beforehand to prevent the systems from marrying, so to speak. But I don't know if that's possible. We're synthesizers.
I'll also say that I think chaos magic draws quite a bit from this, because through the connection of Austin Spare. And Spare was actually connected to Thelema for a number of years.
Sure.
For quite a while. I think it was at least 6 years. And Spare was also a significant influence on Podgorski and his methods, and also the kinds of theories that he uses to not necessarily explain, but he offers them to the reader as food for thought. And I think he's utilized a lot of Spare's ideas as at least a possible metaphor for what this is. And Spare talked about living automata, that sigils were like living automata. Yeah. That's an interesting.
Well, that's a shamanic thing as well, because the shamans would teach that the symbols are alive on like the actual symbol that we see is like the skeleton. It's not the soul. Like these like symbols are alive here, and living things are symbols here. Like we are a symbol ourselves of our innate being.
Right. And that's kind of the idea of an underlying code. And so that's why Enochian, like this is like the grid sigil can be seen as like a skeletonized superstructure depicting our universe and the main types of energy exchanges and the main types of energetic dynamics that take place in our universe. Okay, and the grid sigil is a hyper concentrated depiction of these primary cosmological energies, which include non-Euclidean and quantum reality as being kind of part of the matrix, if you will.
I was going to say malleable.
Yeah.
So then is the grid a representation of the greater matrix then? Is that what we're seeing? Seems to be.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is also an interface, and that's what I was saying. It also exists between, like one pyramid projects downward and the other is projected upwards. I mean, projected downwards from the top, and then the grid also seems to project downwards to a point. Almost, you could also, even though all these layers are also compacted like a Russian doll, like a nesting doll, but they also exist in an expanded format, if that makes sense.
Well, and they also, those Russian dolls, those nesting dolls, they exist artistically as well as vibrationally. Like they are multiple levels existing at multiple levels.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt. That's just
no. So I'm just saying that it is also kind of it functions as an intermediary where it is channeling cosmic creative energies, and then almost like a transformer, it's modulating, containing, and consolidating them, if you will, into our Earth reality or our Earth experience. And because of that, it means also we can use it to go in that direction as well, in a
we can revert to the current,
or we can use it in a horizontal direction where we use it to understand phenomena as they're taking place kind of in front of, before our eyes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very neat. So have you had, this is a very crude question, but have you had an experience with the ethers on any sort of practical or visual level?
The only thing that I can say about the ethers, by the way, Scott Stenwick has just published a book on the ethers.
Excellent.
And it's a serious tome. You know, it's a lot more than I'm able to take on right now. And I would say that I think, but Robert Podgorski also made a very interesting comment about the ethers. And in fact, I believe his next book is going to be like the sacred alignment of the ethers or something like that. It's going to specifically deal with the ethers from his point of view.
Excellent.
Stenwick's book is more focused on the ethers in their historical manifestation, the way Dee received them, the way Dee understood them, which is through the parts of the earth. Okay. But Podgorski is looking at them more from the point of view of the Ohima, which is the soul sheath, and he sees it as more of an inner initiatory structure.
That's how I look at it as well. That's excellent.
Okay. So and I can see that there's no reason to think that it's exclusive to one way or the other. I think both aspects are there, and I think if anything, doing that Enochian middle pillar that I mentioned and just working with the grid sigil, you're already engaging the ethers on some level, especially when you consider that this is the air quadrant. Okay. And anytime you do the grid work and you kind of visualize yourself in that egg shaped quadrant, cosmic egg, if you will, you're already going to experience the ethers, I think, on some level. It's almost like that diagram that I sent you, that the ethers are already there. They're just hidden within that diagram. They're not differentiated so much. Again,
I see.
that's just a suspicion of mine. I'm not certain.
No, that's fascinating. That resonates with me very deeply. Another thing that I've always been curious how others feel about this. I don't think that the paths between Sephiroth are. I don't think that they are. What is the word? I don't think they are synonymous, or I don't think that they're the same as the Aethers, but they seem to be grasping at similar concepts, and it seems like approaching them seems to have a similar effect.
Okay, I think you just hit on something extremely profound, because this isn't. I think we've been kind of groping in this direction. And earlier I mentioned about the idea of the Christian cross with quantum physics added to it. But I
Yes.
actually would go further and consider this as the tree of life and the tunnels of Set, or the connecting paths, as seen through a quantum physics viewpoint rather
Right.
than a Newtonian or kind of the whatever the Cartesian and even Neoplatonic worldview, that see that the tree of life, the Kabbalistic tree of life, is a quite static design, and it is showing kind of the predilection, I think, of the earlier thinkers to think more in static terms. And I think I think this was done for a reason. I think people inherently feared allowing this non-Euclidean serpent-like energy. It's like, you know how they always show the serpent and the lightning on the tree of life, but nobody really wants to talk about what that means. Okay. That's the active wormhole side to it. And those are like taken away from, okay. And it's kind of like a battery. You just took away the contacts. So as long as you don't touch them both, you're okay. But once you touch them, then it's like, oh, whoa, I just got zapped. I think it's kind of like that. I think that the Qabalah was, and the Tree of Life specifically had that dynamic serpentine like quantum energy specifically removed from it, so that neophytes wouldn't really be able to activate it. Okay. I think it was seen as very dangerous. And what I think the grid sigil does is it brings that moving, serpentine, dynamic quality. And so to the glyph, which is essentially very much no different, really, I think, than the Tree of Life. But it's the Tree of Life as almost kind of the way that when Greek philosophers imagined atoms or molecular structures, and then thousands of years later, when the first scientists actually looked under an electron microscope and saw these things. Okay. Now, there is a relationship between the theory and the actual thing, but they're not necessarily going to be quite the same. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at, where the static Tree of Life is a representation of something, whereas the grid sigil is closer to what the inner nature of that thing actually is. The difference between a corpse, if you will, and a living body.
Right.
The corpse is there. You can learn a lot from it, but one thing you won't learn is what makes it go. You're not going to see a bunch of little gears in there.
Right.
So I think in some ways you could make that analogy that, and I don't know the how and the why. I don't even want to begin to speculate on it, but all I can say is, see, in order to be able to work on the molecular level, injecting DNA and viruses into cells, scientists needed to be able to have a real-time manipulable image of the cell. They couldn't have theoretical, even if it was an accurate theoretical concept, it wouldn't translate to actual active manipulation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And that's something odd about the grid sigil, is how active it is. And it's almost like the difference between the cell and the petri dish, and then the Neoplatonic philosophers' idea of the cell. Okay. Or again, if you prefer the corpse versus the living person, again, I can't say as to why that is, but it just seems like that. There's something about the way the grid sigil is showing the constant flow of creative force,
right,
in a way that the static tree of life cannot, because it's closed on every side.
Well, it's almost like the grid sigil is a direct representation of our perception.
Yeah.
Because
or consciousness or what have you.
Yeah, it's almost like where we look determines, and we see this in quantum science, but taking a step back from that, as if we didn't know that, as if we were our ancestors, it's almost as if where we point our perception determines cosmological events. Because it seems like things, like, so for instance, we began focusing on the physical plane, collecting, gathering, hunting, building, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then we began looking out at the stars, at other things. But now we're at this place where we're looking inside at the quantum, subquantum level toward quarks and muons and electrons and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And if you look at what was happening culturally while we were doing this, and if you look at what was happening cosmologically and terrestrially, it's almost as if either we are turning the wheel by pointing our perspective and our perception, or it's almost as if the wheel is turning. The cycle of reality is turning, and that is what is directing our perception.
Yeah, yeah. Which that this is a great segue, I think, to another interesting point about this system, is how macrocosmic it is.
Sure.
A lot of systems, if you do get some kind of effect from them, it's usually quite personal and quite restricted to your private experience or your private sphere. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that other people can perceive the effects of Enochian magic. I'm only saying that when you engage with it, your vision, if you will, becomes much broader. The scales fall from your eyes, so to speak, and you get a much broader, almost a staggering vision of how this system itself is interacting with our reality. Okay. And how even when you nudge it just slightly, you're also creating some kind of unbelievably dynamic shift in the system, right, in the macrocosmic system.
Yeah, that's yes.
Now, I get that there is this is the classic place where some practitioners say, therein begins megalomania. Okay, like I caused the war, I caused the famine, I caused the hurricane. Okay, no, that's crude, because that is suggesting a one-way
relationship.
I caused this.
Right.
You don't, if you really are paying attention to how the grid sigil works and how the Enochian system works, that's far too simplistic and obviously narcissistic to say I caused this. But you do become aware of the mutually self-reflecting qualities that are taking place even between your own inner emotional states and world events, that you'll be able to perceive those relationships that did exist previously. You just didn't see them in the same light.
Right.
Okay. We normally think, I'm in my private sphere. I'm angry right now, but so and so is probably happy over there, and who knows what. Okay. But I don't even just mean individual moods. I mean the arc of transformation. I mean those longer periods of transformation in our lives where quote unquote serious growth is occurring. And I do believe Enochian is some kind of an accelerant. It works a personal evolutionary accelerant, but it also works as a macrocosmic, because whatever you do to yourself is going to be reflected in the outer world. No matter what you do with this system, you just cannot shut it off. And you don't know what those effects are going to be. Okay. And again, not saying you're causing it, but you just become aware that they're happening in the same arena. It's like a soap bubble. Whatever's taking place inside that soap bubble is affecting the whole structure. If there's a mote of dust, it's going to be bouncing off of everything. Okay. And it's kind of like that your vista changes and you begin to see the translucent soap bubble, if that makes sense. Okay. And so, there is this strange macrocosmic quality to it, which is more on the level, I think, of perception rather than causation. But it is interactive. It is interactive. And that's why I feel that Enochian also forces you to really think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, because of that extreme level of
volatility.
What's that?
Oh, I said volatility, but you meant the containment, the nature of the. Okay, I see
the level of quantum entanglement.
Oh, entanglement. Okay, I thought you said containment.
Yeah, okay. One of the things, like I said, is that you really become aware of these incredible levels of quantum entanglement, where the same event will be mirrored at multiple levels of reality. Even if it's an internal event, it will be reflected on multiple levels, from the mundane and the comical to the historical and the cosmic.
That's sort of a shamanic idea to some extent as well. A lot of shamanic traditions teach that you receive a trial at every level. And so like for instance, if you dream about an instance, and in the dream you act inappropriately and you don't fulfill the dream quest or whatever it is, then that force or that form will then manifest at the next level and find you either physically or energetically or what have you, psychologically. And just that idea that these beacons are firing like constantly in communication with one another, entangled, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think the experience of dreams, the world of dreams, especially very what we would call the more extraordinary type of dreams, the more bizarre dreams where the person is like, what? Do you know what I mean? Like, I really felt I went someplace, or I really, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That the dream world and the interaction of dreams and waking reality, that a lot of that has to do with this as well. And like I said, it is, for me, it is a it's a, like I said before, it's a rationally irrational tool, and it's a rationally irrational approach that I have just discovered or whatever. It's a way for me to just deal with life and reality as I find it. Maybe it violates what a therapist might tell me to do.
Sure.
But when you're talking about things like, ancestral patterns, synchronicities, precognitive dreams, standard therapies break down.
Right.
You need a more dynamic tool, and possibly a more dangerous tool to deal with those things. But what's the option? For some people would say, I'd be careful with the stuff like this. It's destabilizing. It'll blub. Oh yeah, okay, don't do it then. You know what I mean? I mean, absolutely. And I can totally understand where some people are coming from, because I'm definitely not recommending this kind of thing to most people. But I am saying, if you do have a certain kind of set of life issues or circumstances, that sometimes, yeah, this might be a rational way of addressing some of those issues. Like if you have a lot of like ancestral trauma and ancestral memory, or traumatic patterns that keep reoccurring in generation after generation after generation. Okay. Oh, well, in that case, yeah, this is the kind of thing that allows you to unravel karma, if you will, potentially. Again, this is just my intuition, but this is something that allows you to kind of at least feel the energy of karma in a very direct, profound sort of way. And then ask the tough questions, like, do I want to continue this line of, and I think that's, you have to see these lines as karmic lines. Well, okay, that you have to ask yourself, like, okay, do I want to continue these same karmic lines? Do I want to project these same? And when I think that, the world registers that as well. Like, does the world want to continue with the same wars, the same exploitation, the same? Okay, we're facing the same question. Okay, when I'm asking questions about my karma, the world is being forced to ask those same questions too, and it becomes a ripple effect. Obviously, I'm not the only one doing that, but there's something about this grid sigil that's a very direct way into the karmic threads. Okay, and that's why I'm saying that there's also this aspect of a singularity to this, where it's also, the grid sigil is representing something that's awaiting us at the end or the beginning of time, depending on which way you're approaching it. Okay, but there's this feeling that just looking at the patterning of recent events, just in the way I believe that we have accelerated, we've gone into this accelerated karmic spiral, where we are minutes away from not only repeating catastrophic mistakes of the past, but of repeating them in a way that actually just dwarfs the kind of carnage that we created in the recent past. Okay, I'm speaking about the first two world wars. But if you trace the so-called karmic lines that extend from European history that led to World War I, and that those same lines were the same lines that led to World War II, because nothing was resolved. That's why World War II happened, because those lines were not resolved. So when they're not resolved, we just repeat. Well, guess what? World War II and those karmic lines were never resolved. I'm now talking about World War II as a frozen conflict. Okay. Sure. And because it was never resolved. And now we are basically re-prosecuting that war because it was never fully resolved. In the same way, each generation is loaded with the unresolved issues of their ancestors, their parents and their grandparents, so forth. And if those things aren't resolved, they just get passed down.
Well, it doesn't seem at all to you like the nature of the interval between events is changing as well. Like in my mind's eye, as I say that, I see a marble dropping on the ground, and like the interval time between is sort of decreasing. At least with the marble, though, the impact lessens as the interval lessens. I'm not sure that's
Unless
how
it
it's going to
enters
result here.
pathological oscillation. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
Because as the bubble is getting smaller,
Right. Exactly. Yeah,
yeah. You know?
But there's more pressure and tension as that occurs.
Exactly. So yes, I think that when Dee received this, and there's always been this underlying idea that the Enochian system is somehow connected to the apocalypse, that there's something fundamentally apocalyptic about it. I know Donald.
Well, I mean, there is though, because the nature of the word apocalypse is apocalypse, right? Which is to remove a veil.
Right.
Now, where is this veil? Is it covering our perception, or is it covering the fabric of the cosmos, or both, or neither? But it is inherently apocalyptic. I think all spiritual work is.
Yeah.
But I mean, it depends on how you define that word. I mean, because there's Ragnarok and there's apocalypse. I mean, there's difference. But
yeah. Well, I mean, they both suggest some kind of renewal at the end of things, and some people would interpret an apocalypse as a transition from one state to another. It doesn't have to be a quote unquote catastrophic ending of everything.
Right.
Yeah. I don't have the understanding to speculate on that. All I can say is that for me, Enochian, and coupled, like I said, with the grid sigil work and some of these other things, it's a kind of like, I guess it's like a last ditch effort to kind of understand myself and to understand this particular point in time that we happen to be in, with all of the changes and transformations that human society has gone through over the last several thousand years. And I find that we have painted ourselves as a culture, as a society, as a global civilization into a corner where we really don't have any idea of where we're going, what we're doing, and how to get out of this mess. We've, the religious view has fallen away. Science has shown that it really can't save us in some miraculous or quasi-miraculous way. And capitalism has shown that those gains that maybe were accrued are now rapidly slipping away. And that capitalism also cannot be a substitute for either religion or technology or whatever else.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think a lot of people who do think about these things are wondering, like, all right, well, where do we go from here? We've explored under the oceans. We've flown up around space. We've drilled under the desert. We've invented this, that, and the other. And it's like, what? So a tiny handful of people are going to go to Mars, and then what are they going to do once they get there?
They're going to take the human condition to Mars as well.
If they're lucky.
If they're lucky.
I think their chances of survival are extremely, extremely low. There's a lot of narcissism and fanfare to create the so-called investment bubble, but I think
Sure.
the cold realities are not very good at all.
Well, and there's surviving and there's successfully thriving.
Exactly. Exactly. And as irrational or as illogical as it seems, like I said, there's something about Enochian, there's something about the metaphors that it contains, there's something about kind of what it does to your thought
Yeah.
that really at least um, I at least find a space where I can kind of engage with what is happening, if that makes sense. I may not find answers, I may not find a resolution, I may not even be able to avert the worst, but at least I feel that Enochian does give you these glimpses of something that's quite real, even though it may be ephemeral because you're only getting a glimpse of it. But there are, I think, there's understandings out there that kind of exceed our culture, kind of exceed our tools.
Certainly.
You know what I mean? And
Uh-huh.
it's like our consciousness has not developed enough or progressed enough in the right directions to be able um, to really engage with these things. Like, yes, we've created the formula for the atom bomb, okay? But Enochian is like that. It is a kind of Manhattan Project, but it's for something. It's not necessarily for this destructive physical device, but it is potentially revolutionary in the sense that it definitely can give you glimpses of things that maybe lie in store for us, or that by engaging with this, it does kind of bring them in a way that could have a sort of adjusting effect, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do feel that there is a kind of odd technology to this system, that this system can be used to create unusual types of change in reality.
Mm-hmm.
I hesitate talking in those terms, but I will go out on a limb and say that, yeah.
Well, it makes sense because of that, the the temporal quality of it. The way that it does seem to come from the beginning and the end simultaneously, I
Yeah.
think is one of the facets that give it that quality of being able to affect things very, very drastically.
Yeah, exactly. And it has a way of piercing through our culturally conditioned ideological filters. I'm not saying that what
Sure.
gets through to us is unfiltered reality, but it
Right.
is a different, and it is a more um it's several layers or stages above where we are now. Okay, I'm not saying it's the ultimate, but it's definitely, there's a way that there's an effect, I think, of this system where it has a way of cutting through or penetrating, like I said, our conditioned ideologies or concepts or realities, or at least forces us to confront them,
Mm-hmm.
whether they're on the level of, you know, personal traumas and setbacks, or whether it's on the level of religious or philosophical ideas, or whether it's anything that has to do with society and civilization, and anything of that sort. Is it allows us to kind of bring in something from outside our preconditioned habitual spheres, even if they're quite intellectual. The
Right.
funny thing about Enochian is that the energy, it's very sentient, but it doesn't have it's not intellectual. It's got a very intuitive, dynamic quality to it.
Right.
That, like I said, it is like, if you think of like when I look at this image, I think of a seed.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As well as the
yeah.
orchic egg. And these are various cosmic influences lending their particular energy to that seed.
Certainly. Yeah, like rain and sunshine and nutrients.
But
yeah.
also trace minerals.
Yeah, nutrients and things. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so if that represents the individual, but it can also represent the planet or the planetary consciousness as well. There's no reason why it shouldn't. But
right. Well, and that's the quality that you were talking about earlier, how these things are happening at multiple levels. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that kind of brings me back to this idea that we were talking about of the diagram and why there is some bizarre or exotic connection between the Enochian system and the stars. Okay? To ground this maybe a little bit in the more like tangible. And whether the stars are meant literally or whether they're meant as a metaphor, I don't know the answer to that. But nonetheless, there seems to be this idea, and it's mirrored in sort of Crowley's idea, every man and woman a star, right?
Sure.
Well, that actually has a lot to do with this, as well as the notion of the so-called holy guardian angel, like the relationship between the star and the HGA, and possibly even the star or a star literally has much to do with this system. And that the higher self and the star seem to be synonyms.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's why the pleroma can be represented as a conclave of stars that are in a higher interaction amongst themselves than, let's say, planets or other lower cosmological entities, if you will, or objects. Okay. And that part of the Enochian system is therefore to reconnect the Earth back to those stellar energies.
Excellent.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And part of why our planet's oscillating strangely is because we've cut off,
severed that connection. Yeah.
And if we talked about those ancient temples, I think there is a reason why they're aligned the way they're aligned.
Very interesting.
So we've kind of gone full circle here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that that's what Enochian allows the individual do, is reconnect to their star or their family of stars or whatever you want to call it. Okay. The star both as an individual and the star also as a collective, stars in general. And so they function as Madriax, that's kind of this notion of the pleroma or the conclave of stars. Like I said, whether that's a metaphor for something or whether it's literal, doesn't matter. But the idea is the same, that the higher can be drawn down into the lower. And because of that, when it imbues the lower, like a seed must be warmed not only by the sun, but if you're into the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, actually by the stars at night, that the most powerful growth radiations come from the planets and the stars at night rather than the sun
and the moon. Yeah.
And the moon, exactly. And so that ultimately, I think, is where the transformative and evolutionary aspects of Enochian come from, that they are connected to star lore, and that places them in a very Egyptian Neoplatonic cultural line, if that makes sense. Okay. And that's basically what this, and so the individual is therefore ascending, but at the same time it's being drawn down from the top. And what I found, and what really brought this to my attention, was there are interesting word plays sometimes you'll find in Enochian, and I haven't really gone hunting for them, but I again, whether I'm making this up or not doesn't really matter, but it is there nonetheless. is that Scott Stenwick makes a distinction between the element of Earth and the planet Earth. And apparently, in the Enochian system, there's actually a distinction between the two. And the element Earth is Nanta. But the planet is Chaos Go.
Yep.
The word chaos.
Oh, yeah.
In there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And that means that from the higher point of view, this must look like a rather chaotic realm.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so it's interesting, this, again, order and chaos.
Well, and the idea too that Iad, IAD, is like Yod or Yod, the Hebrew letter, which is the spirit of all the other letters.
Exactly.
Every letter in Hebrew is written with the Yod, either extended or. So yeah, I definitely was doing that whole dance as well between Yod and Chaosigo and Nanta and all of that is definitely something that I've danced with before. And that's how you know that the ancients weren't stupid. Like, they differentiated between different types of earth. They knew that the philosophical fire wasn't the same that cooked their food and kept them warm.
That's right.
And the terminology distinguishes that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think you brought up alchemy just now when you talked about philosophical fire. And I think that's what we see, is that the grid sigil is also the elements in their philosophical form. Okay. Their alchemical form. And you can, maybe that's not what you will perceive right away, but that's, I think, what their teleological side is, that you can use the grid sigil to come closer and closer to the philosophical, or if you will, the divine nature of the elements as they descend from spirit, okay, which is EHNB or Enub in the Enochian system, because it's the anagram of the four elements, right? Exarp, Hekoma, Bitam, and Nanta. So EHNB, and that becomes a symbol for the ether or the nous.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's funny too, because as the things break down into more and more subtle levels, the meaning of them almost breaks down as well as you sort of dissolve into them, because meaning is sort of derived from contrast.
Yeah, so, meaning is one step removed from the reality.
Yeah. So as you approach a system like this to try to understand it, as you become a part of it,
exactly,
it breaks down what you even approached in the first place.
Solvay and coagula.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Why it does that. And yeah, I slipped my mind, but yeah, there was something that you said that reminded me of something. Well, we'll get back to it.
Well, I'm not sure what I said. We were talking about the different terminologies and.
Okay, I just remembered. So Plotinus said, it is a famous quote of his to his disciples, and he says, "Turn yourselves into living temples."
Ooh.
Which is a very tantric idea, but when you think of it in the West from an Egyptian or a Pythagorean point of view, okay, it's maybe different methodologies, somewhat different concepts, but the idea is the same. That's what tantric Buddhists are doing when they're turning themselves into the deity. Okay, deity, temple, stupa, it's all the same. Okay, but I think that's kind of also this idea here is, this is what connects it to those so-called deification practices, whether it's what shamans were doing or Egyptian priests were doing or Hebrew prophets were doing, rituals of ascent and descent, Merkaba.
Right, yeah, right.
This is a modern Merkaba practice.
Sure.
Okay. And it's an open source Merkaba.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know that's a mouthful, and it's cheeky, but yes, open source Merkaba is one way I would describe this.
I love it.
Enochian has dissolved all dogmatic trappings. Okay. It is a system that you can use in any way you see fit. And yet it will almost always produce very similar and recognizable results. Like if you were to mix this with Norse and Greek and Rosicrucian, and I was just to stick to the Podgorski and the Stenwick material, I think we would, if we were to compare notes, a lot of our insights and experiences, I think, would have a very similar, if not identical, flavor.
And that would show a lot of validity to the system as well.
And so this system actually loves to be eclectically blended and wedded to other systems, is what I've noticed. That it accelerates.
Well, that almost makes it sound parasitic to some degree.
It is. But what is solvate coagulate? It's digestive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It bites off things and then digests them like an earthworm. We're back to the tunnels. And what the earthworm spits out is actually better than what went in.
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
I forget what that material is called, but yeah, it is. It's much more nutrient rich.
The brass.
Yeah.
So I actually think excrement is a powerful metaphor for not only the Qliphothic side of the Enochian system, but also as a powerful metaphor for understanding how this system operates, not just contra naturam, but via naturam, like also in a very Taoist kind of way as well. It's got that element of what all life seems to do, which is to eat, to digest, and then excrete, and then decay. Okay. So it is doing that as well. And I think the excrement is a powerful metaphor. Like it takes excrement, whether it's dogmatic excrement or philosophical excrement, and even societal collapse is a type of excrement that can be potentially alchemically absorbed and transmuted.
I was just imagining the tower in my mind's eye when you were talking about that. And then you said societal collapse, which is like buildings being destroyed. Yeah, that's hilarious.
There you go.
Man. Well, was there anything else about the grid sigil or Enochian or the last year that you wanted to mention?
No, all I can say is that it's the place that I'm at now is a very unexpected place. It was a very circuitous, a very crazy zigzag lightning bolt style of personal evolution. A lot of what appeared to be setbacks, and a lot of like not knowing, my God, because I actually put all magic stuff aside for several months as well. I don't know if you did anything similar to that, but for a number of months, I'd say, I almost want to say close to a year, I put a lot of magical practice, reading, thinking about, I put all of that aside for a while. It was a combination, I think, of burnout, but burnout often signifies a change to a new paradigm.
Right.
Okay. So I think I incinerated my previous paradigm. I went into a period of oscillation and chaos, didn't know where it was going to go. And I had to stop all my stuff just to ride it out, not knowing where it was going to end. And I did spend a lot of time focusing on writing and reading and doing all that kind of stuff. And yet I think it's only been in the last few months that I've kind of started getting back into it again in a very different way. I started playing around with Thelema probably about 6 months ago.
Okay.
And I have been Crowley adjacent for years.
Right.
But there's always been something that has kept me from like fully embracing his work.
Yeah.
It's too confining, it's too constraining, it's got too many sort of like I don't need to exchange one hierarchical system for another hierarchical system. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think there's but having said that, there's a lot of food for thought in Thelema. And there's a lot of confrontational material in Thelema that really causes you to think. Um, what's nice about the grid sigil is it allows you to control, like a dimmer switch, how much you want to engage with some other practice or paradigm or
And how does it go about doing that in your perspective?
I honestly don't know. I'll say that in the case of Thelema, Podgorski himself has a background in Thelema, so I think Thelemic ideas are naturally filtered into the system.
Sure.
And it shows that I can engage with it. I also think the grid sigil creates a kind of universal framework that once you work with it enough, you begin to realize that the system's kind of just limited by your own imagination. And
right,
you can be as streamlined or as wild as you want to be. It's really up to you and what works best for you. But I found that there does seem to be an interesting relationship between the Crowley revelation and some of the ideas that are buried in the grid sigil work, primarily stuff that I think relates to the Qliphothic side of things. That's probably one of the least discussed aspects of the system. And that's something I think only Podgorski has talked about, like, deliberately.
right.
And even so, those chapters on the tunnels of Set and how they relate and so on, they're fairly vague.
Right.
And I think it's that way on purpose. I think this is a very new and a very controversial and possibly a very volatile side of the system. But I also think it's one that somehow is extremely active. I think the whole Crowley, Kenneth Grant, Typhonian, Falorio, but as filtered into the grid sigil work, side of things is it's an oddly active element, and it kind of reminds me of the way if you've read Night Side of Eden, there's kind of that opening paragraph where Kenneth Grant has that I call it the opening salvo, where he says, we live in a time basically where the borders and the boundaries between what is real and what is fictional are completely disintegrating. Okay.
Right.
And whether Thelema inaugurated that or Thelema simply commemorated what was already happening.
Yeah, magnified it maybe.
Exactly. But nonetheless, this idea that the spiritual fabric of our reality has somehow shifted in a dramatic way, where what you would call Qliphothic or underworld energies are increasingly prevalent, increasingly active, and increasingly demanding some kind of response from us. See, we have yet to really even acknowledge these things. Yeah, I just think that there's something about this, about Crowley specifically, where he really opened up the whole Qliphothic Setian perspective. And that actually, if you look at the theology of Thelema, maybe it's not like openly saying this, but it's definitely opening the doors to this. It's saying, like, okay, people, whether you like me or not, whether you think I'm a disgusting perverted freak, or you think I'm out of mind, this document is something that maybe not the document itself, but what the document is describing is something that you're going to have to deal with at some point. Okay. And because actually, Liberal is a horrifying, terrifying text if you've ever pondered it.
If you read it if you read it from a like fundamentalist perspective, like certainly.
Yeah. Exactly. And so that text is it's kind of a confrontational text, I think, in a lot of ways. It's confrontational politically, it's confrontational religiously, it's confrontational emotionally, it's confrontational cosmologically. It's a very deeply confrontational text. And because of that, I think it also functions as a weird gate or as a weird wormhole unto itself. Okay. That if people can get past their squeamishness, they'll find strange things on the other side of that text or slash wormhole. Okay.
Right.
So that's just going back to what I was saying. That's kind of how I started to understand Crowley. I started to understand Crowley primarily from a new aeon perspective, and that the real core, every ritual that he did, every statement that he made, and especially Liber Al and later, 231 and all that business, that specifically what he's really talking about is this new aeon. Okay. I mean, I think we should have another discussion about what the new aeon really
yeah, that's a whole thing in itself.
But I will say that it is the foundation for what I believe the grid sigil represents, that the grid sigil is a new aeon tool fundamentally. Okay.
Interesting.
And the new aeon also represents a recapitulation of primordial or even Atlantean energies, if you will.
Right.
Why an Atlantean or Lovecraftian feel to the grid sigil, because it is a new aeon tool. Okay. If you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, that's a static old aeon representation. And this is a dynamic, post-modern animistic glyph, if you will, that is
interpretation. Right.
Exactly. And that's why every time you work with the grid sigil, you're actually invoking the new aeon. If that makes sense, you're working with the new aeon. Perhaps even you're creating it on some level or giving birth to it. Okay, so
very interesting.
That's my final kind of little piece.
That's
what I want to maybe leave off is this idea of that this Crowley's concept of the new aeon is kind of this main hinge point that Thelema, Enochian, and the grid sigil, and like I said, the macrocosm as well, that they all somehow hinge upon this
Crowleyan fulcrum.
Yeah. I hesitate to use the word Crowley. I prefer maybe the new aeon. But yes, he, as someone who picked up on this before other people.
I prefer that as well. Yeah, I think he was less of... He was perceiving it, I think, like you said, and he was yelling it the loudest, so he got recorded the most. I have a hard time seeing Crowley as an actual prophet, but I think maybe
if you look at some of the zanier Hebrew prophets in the later biblical,
the
ones that like rolled around in the mud and slept with prostitutes and babbled incoherently and foamed at the mouth.
Sure.
Honestly, he does sound like a modern day Hebrew prophet, like just, you know what I mean? I mean, with all those paradoxes in tow. But yeah, I forget, one of the famous Hebrew prophets was like rolling around in the mud and sleeping with prostitutes and foaming at the mouth. You know what I mean? There's a precedent for that. And you could see Crowley perhaps as a continuation of Judeo-Christian prophecy.
He just strikes me as the type to mimic. the only reason that I'm going to say this, and it's going to come off as very abrasive, but it is what it is. The only way I can stomach Crowley, perceiving him in his entirety, is by viewing him through the lens of adept, aspirant, and artificer. Because I see him going through these stages of, like, okay, like he's talking about, he's not he's not being grandiose, he's being very practical, and that's like his aspirant and adept phase. But then there was parts where I very much feel like he was making things up. I think Crowley strikes me as the type to have a revelation philosophically and then play it out dramatically as some revelation.
Yeah.
And so that's my view on Crowley, is that he definitely was gifted and adept in his craft, but that he was also he was a thespian. He was dramatic.
Oh yeah.
And I could see how I, in his shoes, would have a revelation about, I showed you that picture of the zodiacal loop.
Oh yeah.
I could see someone like Crowley looking at that image and then naturally twisting the other loop to make it smooth, and then coming up with a reason why that was the true way, and dragging his wife to some museum or to a great pyramid to play out this whole drama. I'm not saying that is what happened, but yeah, so I didn't mean to say that it was all hinging on a Crowley fulcrum, but I was just saying that it seems that way because Crowley is sort of harbored as the messiah of the new aeon, when I don't know if he would have, you know, God's forbid, fallen out of a tree and died as a kid, the new aeon would have come about. So yeah.
Yeah, possibly, or it would have come about through somebody else, and it would have a
Right.
flavor to it. I couldn't say. I will say that you need a lot of filters, I think, to deal with Crowley, to benefit from Crowley.
Sure.
I think you need to be circumspect as to picking and choosing what you I yeah, I there's only, with me, my intake of Crowley is very selective.
Sure.
And I engage with him more on the level of a precursor or a phenomenon, or as someone like, it's kind of like how military strategists, they study ancient battles to gain
Right.
insight into modern warfare. I think Crowley is like that because in many ways military struggle has remained very much the same. So you can still learn from ancient battles. So in that sense, but Crowley's oddly, he's like I said, there is this new aeon side to him where a lot of what he did and a lot of what he said, I don't think has been fully digested by the cult. And
yeah, I don't either. Yeah.
I think we've been sidetracked by the sensationalism.
Right.
I think we've actually steered away from the horrifying aspects of what he's really talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
And whether those horrifying aspects are going to literally come to pass, or whether they represent tendencies within ourselves that we ignore at our peril, and I think both can be true. To that extent, I don't think Crowley has been well digested by most occultists, even by people who are what I would almost call like robotic Crowley,
Yeah.
worshippers. I don't know, but like I said, for me, filtering Crowley through the grid sigil is an effective way of getting the deeper sense, I think, of his ideas without getting too radioactive in the process.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, regardless of my own feelings for Crowley, I certainly respect him and certainly am thankful because without, I mean, just Liber 777 and 231, I mean, whether or not I use those regularly or not, they inspired the works of others that I have and do use regularly. So, not meaning to, cast any shade at Crowley, but I definitely, you got to take him with a grain of salt. And as you mentioned, filtering him through something.
I'll add one last thing, and that is that, believe me, Crowley is far and away far from being quote unquote my favorite person or even type of person. So what my reassessment of Crowley has finally come to mean is actually a much more sober and realistic assessment with Crowley, and one that I actually make against my preferences. See, I would much rather that Mother Teresa be right about the way the universe really is. I'd much rather Maximus the Confessor be right. And I'm not saying reality and physics can't shift and those, but I'm saying Crowley called the world that we live in, the reality, the consensus reality that we occupy. I actually believe that consensus reality can shift and change.
Sure.
But the bag of shit that we're holding on to now is what Crowley described. Okay.
Yeah.
Not what St. Maximus the Confessor described. It's not what Mother Teresa described. Okay. It's not even what Elon Musk described. It's the one who wins the prize for coming closest is Crowley. Okay.
Well, yeah.
And so to me, there is this objective. I'd rather not be with Crowley, but the reality forces me to acknowledge that, yeah, out of everyone, he basically called it. Okay.
Well,
and then where do I go from there? You see?
Well, like one, if you take an objective look at our reality as it stands today, most of us wouldn't choose this reality.
Exactly.
So that means
do I want Therion and Iowas and Babylon raining havoc on me? No. But is that what's happening? Yeah, it looks like it.
Well, and the fact that he expressed a somewhat real take on reality, he wasn't trying to candy coat it. He wasn't trying to sell another baptism. Like there's that. So what was I gonna say? Crowley, most of us wouldn't choose this reality. The other thing was, I think part of the reason Crowley got a better look at reality is because he was more of a syncretist. If we look at Mother Teresa, she seems to come from one tradition, but if we look at Crowley, I mean, he was a student of many traditions, which means he might have eaten more pieces of the pie.
And that's the way the world has become. The globalization.
Interesting.
Looks like I'm running out of juice here.
Uh-oh. Well, all right, let's jump to the last question. What is next for you? What do you have planned for the next year?
Just to make it through this crazy both personally and collectively.
Right. And, yeah, there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, there is. And I really can't say that much more than that because there's a lot of unknowns. Like I said, personally, there's a lot of unknowns. And I think where things are headed culturally, politically, sociologically, what have you, I think there are a lot of unknowns, and we'll just have to see. And for me, this work is just an eccentric way to deal with all of that and hopefully make a change for the better.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you opening up a bit of your life to share with us. I'm sure we'll continue this discussion after this, but yeah, have a good rest of the weekend, and thanks for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. All the best.
Take care.